You ever get that feeling? Like the world's changing so fast, you're just trying to keep up.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of what we're talking about today, Europe's economy. Lots of big decisions, and we're going to unpack why it matters, even if you don't live there.
Right.
So you sent over these two pieces, The Declining Europe, pretty strong words, right?
Yeah.
It's about what Mario Draghi,
Former ECB president.
exactly, thinks Europe needs to do, to get back on track.
Yeah.
And then this Future of European Competitiveness report. Wow. Dense.
It's a beast.
But hey, that's what we're here for, right?
That's right. We'll break it down.
So we always hear Europe, economic powerhouse, innovation. How'd they end up feeling behind?
Well, this report, it calls it a trifecta of challenges.
Okay, dramatic, but...
A little dramatic, sure, but they're not wrong. First, you get this innovation lag, turning good ideas into, those big global companies. They're struggling with that, especially in tech. And actually, get this, no EU tech company founded in the last 50 years is worth over $100 billion.
Really?
Yeah. Think about that. 0 companies the size of like an Apple or Amazon in, 50 years?
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that here in the U.S.
Right.
We just assume our tech guys are, the big players.
Yeah.
Okay, so challenge 1. What's next on Europe's list of worries?
Number 2, we've all heard about this one, the energy crunch.
Right.
Depending on Russian gas. That was the vulnerability. But here's the thing. Even as they're trying to go green, right, decarbonize, this report, it makes it clear that's expensive.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it could really hurt their ability to compete if they don't do it super carefully.
It's a tough needle to thread, isn't it? You want to hit those climate goals, but you also got to keep the lights on.
It is. And as if those two weren't enough, there's a third big challenge. They call it the geopolitical reality check. Basically, the old world order. The one that, let's be honest, Europe kind of benefited from. It's gone.
Yeah.
And this report, they really emphasize Europe needs to be way more self-sufficient, especially when it comes to security, like yesterday.
So, okay, let me get this straight. Innovation gap, energy crisis, and the world's kind of a mess.
Pretty much.
I gotta admit, even just talking about it makes me a little nervous. What does this actually mean for people, though? Are we talking like higher prices, people losing their jobs? How does this big picture stuff actually play out in, day-to-day life? In Europe and here?
You're hitting on the big question, and it's why, honestly, we should all be paying attention to how this plays out for Europe. We're talking about a globalized world, right? Europe struggles. Eventually, everyone feels that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Take, for example, America and tech. We kind of take it for granted, right?
Yeah.
But think about it. If Europe isn't creating its own tech giants, it means globally, we're relying more and more on just this handful of American companies.
Huh. I hadn't thought about it that way. It really is all connected, isn't it?
It is. And then there's the big one, the one everyone's thinking about, China. Right. Their rise, it presents huge opportunities, but also some very real risks for everyone. And how Europe manages that relationship, it's going to have a global impact.
Yeah.
Because they need to figure out how to cooperate, but also protect their own interests.
It's a lot for them to juggle. It's almost like they have to reinvent themselves on the world stage. Speaking of which, this report, it doesn't just lay out the problems, does it?
Well, no.
They have ideas about how to fix this.
They do, and surprisingly detailed ones. They break it down into 3 main areas. The first one, they call it supercharging innovation, basically tackling that gap we were talking about.
Yeah.
And they argue Europe needs to be much more ambitious and maybe a little less afraid of risk, especially when it comes to research and development, like how they fund it, what they choose to fund.
So less like making small changes and more like big swings.
Exactly. They actually use the term moonshot thinking.
I like it.
Europe, they say, should be going for those huge breakthroughs, not just, small improvements here and there. And to prove their point, they look at the difference in funding between the EU's European Innovation Council. It's called the EIC.
Okay.
They've got about $256 million.
Okay.
And then there's the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
DARPA.
They've got a budget over $3.8 billion.
Wow. Big difference.
Yeah.
And just for our listener, DARPA, they're the ones with all those futuristic research projects.
Right, the fun ones.
Self-technology, the internet.
GPS,
yeah.
Things like that. Exactly. And the report is basically saying Europe, they need to be ready to take those kinds of risks. It's not always about how much money, but what you do with it.
Moonshot thinking. Okay, I'm into it. What's the next thing they want to tackle?
So the second one is tricky. It's this balancing act they call decarbonization without deindustrialization.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
Because on the one hand, Europe's got these really ambitious climate goals,
Right.
which is great. But on the other hand, they know they can't decarbonize in a way that destroys jobs or makes their industries weaker compared to countries with, let's say, more relaxed environmental rules.
Right, right. I bet that's especially tough for industries like automotive,
Exactly.
because that's such a huge part of Europe's economy, but also a big part of the emissions problem.
And the report actually uses that industry. Automotive as an example. They say that even though Europe's been pushing for electric vehicles, which is good,
Right.
they haven't done enough to support the whole system.
Oh, interesting.
Like, how do you build enough batteries? What about the charging stations, all the infrastructure that's needed?
It's one thing to set the goal, it's another to actually, make it happen.
Right. You need the foundation.
So what's the last piece of their plan for Europe's big comeback?
The last one is strategic, not protectionist trade, which is a mouthful, but
Yeah.
it basically means Europe needs to play the global trade game, but smarter. Make strategic partnerships, get access to things like raw materials, new technology, but also they have to stand up to unfair trade practices, especially from, well,
China.
China.
Right. Protect your interests, but also be open to working together. Makes sense. But there was this one recommendation that kind of surprised me.
Oh, yeah.
They say Europe should encourage companies, specifically in telecoms, to merge. But isn't that usually seen as, bad for competition? It feels like we're so used to hearing about the benefits of competition, especially in tech. Why would encouraging consolidation in something like telecoms be a good thing for Europe?
It does seem counterintuitive on the surface, but the report makes the case that Europe's telecom sector is actually too fragmented for its own good. Apparently, there are over 30 mobile network operators in the EU compared to just a handful in the US and China. Their argument is that this fragmentation makes it much harder for EU operators to compete on a global scale and holds them back from making the kinds of investments needed in things like 5G and fiber optic networks, the infrastructure for the future.
Yeah, so it's a trade-off, potentially less choice for consumers in the short term, but with the goal of building the backbone that will allow Europe to be more competitive in the long run. And you can't have innovation without that digital foundation in place, can you?
Precisely. The digital world isn't going anywhere, and Europe needs to be a leader, not a follower. Of course, all of these recommendations, from moonshot thinking to telecoms consolidation, rely on the EU's ability to actually implement these changes. And as the report acknowledges, that's not always Europe's strong suit.
It does feel like the million-dollar question, can they actually pull this off? Europe has a bit of a reputation for struggling with implementation when it comes to these big, ambitious plans. What are the biggest hurdles they're likely to face?
The report doesn't shy away from the challenges, which I appreciate. They call out this inherent tension between national interests and the need for EU-level action. You can almost imagine those boardroom meetings now.
Everyone around the table, each with their own priorities.
Exactly. They use the example of semiconductor production. Individual European countries are, understandably, hesitant to give up control over something so strategically important, even though it's pretty clear that a more coordinated EU-wide approach would be far more effective.
Too many cooks in the kitchen, or maybe too many chefs in this case. It's easy to get bogged down in the weeds with this stuff, but let's take a step back. Let's say for a moment that Europe does manage to push past these challenges and really commit to this new industrial strategy. What does that mean for the rest of us? What kind of global power does a revitalized Europe become?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that has massive implications. If the EU can overcome these hurdles and successfully implement this strategy, you're talking about a potential powerhouse, a Europe that's a leader in innovation, that's energy independent, and that speaks with one unified voice on the world stage that's a force to be reckoned with.
It would definitely shake things up geopolitically. I'm thinking about their relationship with the U.S., with China. Would a more economically and technologically powerful Europe become a closer ally to the U.S., or would they chart their own more independent course? And how would China, which has, let's be honest, benefited from a somewhat fragmented Europe at times, respond to a more assertive, unified EU? Fascinating stuff to consider.
Isn't it? We're potentially witnessing a real turning point for Europe, where they decide who they want to be in this new global landscape. And the outcome will have major ripple effects for all of us.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to keep an eye on. For you listening, we'd love to hear your take on all this. Do you think Europe can pull off this ambitious reinvention? What kind of global power do you think they should be in the 21st century? Let us know your thoughts, and who knows, maybe this will be the first of many deep dives into Europe's future.